Welcome, dear listener, and thank you for joining me tonight. As the world outside your window grows still, allow your thoughts to slow as well. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and prepare to drift gently into another time, another place. Tonight, we travel to Renaissance France, a world of candlelit halls, jeweled gowns, and whispered intrigues. A world where shadows often lingered just beyond the glitter of the crown. The year is 1533, and Paris is alive with celebration. Wedding bells echo across the rooftops, their sound ringing bright and triumphant against the autumn sky. Torches line the streets, their flames swaying in the evening breeze. Flowers, roses, lilies, violets, are scattered underfoot, their perfume mingling with the smoke of roasting meats and spiced wine. Crowds gather along narrow lanes to watch the grand procession pass, craning their necks for a glimpse of the bride who has traveled all the way from Italy to become a queen of France. At first glance, the city seems entirely caught up in joy. Musicians play lutes and flutes, their melodies weaving into the clamor of voices. Nobles parade in silks and furs, their jewels catching the firelight. Courtiers murmur excitedly about alliances, fortunes, and the promise of heirs. And yet, if one listens closely, beneath the laughter and music, there are whispers. Quiet words passed from lip to ear, that the bride is no beauty, that she comes from a family known for both art and poison, that her place here is not entirely welcome. Her name is Catherine de' Medici. She is just 14 years old. Catherine comes not from the golden throne of Italy, but from its shadows. Orphaned as an infant, she was the last legitimate descendant of a once powerful dynasty. Raised in convents, tutored in the art of survival rather than in comfort, she learned early how to watch, how to listen, how to wait. Now, she steps onto the grand stage of France, her figure small beside the glittering nobles who surround her, her dark eyes observing everything. Picture her on this wedding day. Her gown is heavy with cloth of gold, embroidered with pearls that shimmer in the firelight. A crown rests upon her dark hair, its jewels carefully chosen to dazzle the French court. Yet beneath the finery, her hands tremble just slightly, the hands of a girl thrust into a world that will demand every ounce of her strength. She walks beside her new husband, Henry, the Duke of Orleans, a boy only a little older than herself. Their steps are measured, rehearsed, their expressions carefully schooled. The people cheer, though their eyes do not soften. To them, Catherine is a foreigner. An Italian girl whose family's name stirs equal measures of admiration and suspicion. For the Medici are remembered not only as patrons of art and learning, but also as masters of intrigue. Whispers cling to them like smoke, of secret dealings, of hidden poisons, of marriages arranged not for love but for power. Tonight, those whispers follow Catherine through the torchlit streets of Paris. Still, she carries herself with quiet dignity. There is no outburst of nerves, no faltering in her step. Instead, she observes. She notices the golden tapestries that hang from balconies, the way the nobles glance at her and then exchange knowing looks, the scent of roses layered carefully over the less pleasant smells of the crowded city. She sees, she remembers, and she endures. This is the beginning of her journey, from a fragile Italian bride to a queen whose name will forever be bound to mystery, shadow, and rumor. In the decades to come, she will be called cunning, cruel, even poisonous. She will be blamed for wars, for assassinations, for massacres. But tonight, she is only a girl, standing at the threshold of a new life, her fate hidden like the stars behind a veil of autumn clouds. As the bells continue to toll, the procession reaches the grand cathedral. Inside, the air is thick with incense and the murmur of prayers. Candles burn in golden candelabras, their flames flickering as the bride and groom kneel before the altar. Nobles watch closely, their whispers never ceasing. The marriage is not just a union of two young souls, it is a joining of dynasties, a gamble of power, a wager placed on the future of France itself. And Catherine knows this. For all her youth, she understands that her life will not be her own. She will be judged for her beauty, her fertility, her loyalty to a court that does not truly welcome her. She will be measured not by her heart, but by the children she bears, by the alliances she strengthens, by the secrets she keeps. In this moment, surrounded by music and prayer, she bows her head and steels herself. Outside, the city grows darker. The torches along the streets burn lower, their flames flickering against the night. Revelers feast and drink, their laughter carrying into the cool air. But in the quiet corners of Paris, far from the glitter of the cathedral, the whispers grow louder. The Italian girl, they say, the daughter of Medici, what shadows will she bring to France? And so our story begins, not with poison in a cup or daggers in the night, but with a wedding. With roses underfoot, with music in the air, with a young bride stepping into a world that will test her again and again. She is fragile now, but fragility can harden into strength. Innocence can twist into cunning. A girl can become a queen, and a queen can become a legend, whether she wills it or not. And from here, dear listener, from the glitter of wedding celebrations, we shall step softly into the reality of court intrigue, where power is never given, only taken. The story of Catherine de' Medici begins long before the glittering wedding bells of Paris. To understand the young bride who stepped so carefully into France, we must return to the city of Florence, where she was born in the year 1519. Florence was not only a place of beauty, with its painted chapels and grand palaces, but also of peril, where power was both dazzling and dangerous. Catherine's very name carried both blessing and curse, for she was a Medici. The Medici were the most famous family in Italy, patrons of artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, protectors of scholars and builders of churches. Their wealth had shaped the Renaissance itself, filling Florence with paintings, sculptures, and libraries of learning. Yet behind this glittering facade lay a darker story. To many, the Medici were not only patrons but manipulators, masters of intrigue who dealt in whispers, secrets, and sometimes, so rumor said, poison. For those who admired them, they were visionaries. For those who feared them, they were shadows cloaked in velvet. Catherine was born into this legacy but orphaned almost as soon as she entered the world. Her father, Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, died when she was just a few weeks old. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, followed soon after. The infant girl, so small and fragile, was left in the care of relatives and the church. Her inheritance was not safety, but survival. Raised in convents, Catherine learned early to adapt. She grew up within stone walls where silence was part of daily life. The nuns who guided her were strict but protective, teaching her to read, to write, to pray. Yet Catherine's education was not only in letters and scripture, it was in observation. She learned to notice the small things, the way voices shifted when secrets were near, the way glances carried meaning beyond words, the way power was exercised in whispers rather than shouts. By the time she was a girl of 10, Florence itself was torn by upheaval. Rival factions rose against the Medici, and Catherine, as the last legitimate heir of her line, became a symbol to be guarded, or to be used. There was a time when the mob surrounded her convent, shouting for her blood. The young girl, barely more than a child, was hidden behind thick walls, her fate balanced on decisions far beyond her control. In that moment, Catherine learned the first rule of her life: survival is not given, it is fought for, quietly, patiently, with endurance. And so, by the time she left Florence for France as a teenager, Catherine was no ordinary bride. She was already schooled in hardship, already shaped by danger. Yet the French court did not see her strength. Instead, they saw only an awkward foreign girl. In the glittering halls of Paris, beauty was currency, and Catherine, with her dark eyes and solemn expression, did not fit the standard. She was mocked for her plainness, for her Italian manners, even for her clothes. Whispers followed her down the corridors, the little Italian, they sneered, with her big eyes and her strange ways. Imagine her in those early days, walking through the palace gardens. Around her, French noblewomen laughed softly, their gowns rustling as they exchanged glances. Catherine, small and slight, carries a book in Italian pressed tightly to her chest. Its leather cover is worn, its pages filled with words that remind her of home. The courtiers notice and laugh, mocking her for clinging to her native tongue, for not bending fast enough to French ways. She lowers her eyes, but she does not let go of the book. That small gesture, the refusal to surrender what was hers, was the quiet seed of her resilience. The contrast could not be sharper. To the French, Catherine was the foreign girl from a family stained by suspicion. They thought her fragile, insignificant, even laughable. Yet within her, the lessons of Florence lived on. She had learned to watch, to wait, to endure. Where others saw a timid bride, she was quietly storing every detail, every insult, every piece of knowledge she could gather. For survival is often silent. It does not shout, it does not boast. It bides its time, it bends without breaking. Catherine would bend many times in the years ahead, through mockery, through neglect, through tragedy. But she would not break. This was the seed of power planted in her childhood, that in a world filled with glittering enemies and whispered rumors, the one who survives longest may yet prevail. And Catherine de' Medici, underestimated by those around her, was already learning how to survive. From her orphan beginnings in Florence to her lonely days in the French court, she was shaped not by luxury, but by endurance. And it was this endurance that, in time, would allow her to transform from the overlooked foreign bride into a queen who would wield influence through some of France's darkest hours. And so, dear listener, from these early seeds of survival, let us step further into Catherine's world, into the glittering halls of the French court, where luxury sparkled but daggers gleamed just beneath the surface. Step with me now, dear listener, into the gilded halls of Renaissance France. The torches outside fade, the cathedral bells grow still, and we find ourselves in the palace where Catherine de' Medici's new life begins. The French court in the 16th century was a place of extraordinary splendor. Picture great banquets set beneath ceilings painted with stars and angels, their beams glittering with chandeliers hung heavy with candles. The air was thick with perfumes, orange blossom, rosewater, musk, layered to mask the less pleasant sense of crowded rooms and unwashed garments. Long tables stretched from end to end, draped with embroidered cloth, and piled with roasted meats, sugared fruits, and silver goblets brimming with deep red wine. Musicians played the lute and viol, their melodies winding through the hum of voices, while masked dancers swirled across the marble floors. Everywhere you looked, there was color. Crimson silks, sapphire velvets, gold-threaded gowns that shimmered as their wearers turned. Jewels winked at throats and wrists, rings caught the firelight, and feathered fans fluttered like wings as noblewomen leaned in close to whisper secrets. To an outsider, the court seemed like a dream of endless luxury, a theater where wealth and elegance performed on a nightly stage. And yet, beneath the sparkle, shadows gathered. The French court was not simply a place of celebration, it was a battlefield, where the weapons were not swords but smiles, not shields but whispers. Every banquet was a contest of alliances. Every masked ball concealed as much as it revealed. Behind the laughter, courtiers measured each other's power, their fortunes, their proximity to the throne. Catherine, young and still awkward among them, stood at the edge of these glittering displays. She was rarely at the center of attention, rarely invited into the games of wit and charm that filled the air. Instead, she watched. Her dark eyes followed the movements of those around her, the way one nobleman bowed too deeply to a duke, the way a lady brushed her fan against another's sleeve, signaling an unspoken alliance. She listened, not only to the words but to the silences between them, to the subtle shifts of tone that carried more meaning than speeches. At times, she was ridiculed for her simplicity. French courtiers, with their jeweled gowns and elaborate hairstyles, scoffed at her plain appearance, her foreign accent, her preference for books rather than gossip. They saw a shy Italian girl out of her depth in their world of glitter. What they did not see was that Catherine was learning. She was building a library not of parchment, but of people, storing away knowledge of who smiled too quickly, who avoided whose gaze, who whispered behind which fan. The hypocrisy of the court revealed itself to her in every glance. Nobles who toasted each other with overflowing cups would plot against one another the moment their backs were turned. Dancers who embraced beneath candlelight exchanged cutting remarks the following morning. Even laughter, bright and ringing, could be sharpened into a blade. Catherine saw it all. And though she rarely spoke, she remembered. Imagine one evening, a masked ball held in honor of the king. The hall glitters with golden light, the music swells, and dancers move like ripples across the floor. At the center, the king laughs loudly, his courtiers echoing with practiced delight. Catherine, standing at the margin, clutches her mask, its ribbon tight in her hand. No one notices her silence. Yet as she gazes across the sea of silks and jewels, she sees a courtier slip away, exchanging a glance with another in the shadows. She sees the Queen Mother smile too sweetly at a rival. She sees, in fragments and gestures, the undercurrent of power shifting beneath the polished surface. It was here, in these glittering halls, that Catherine's quiet cunning began to take shape. She learned that to survive in such a world, one did not need to be the loudest voice or the brightest jewel. One only needed to endure, to watch, and to understand. Power, she realized, was not always in the hand that struck the blow, it was in the eye that foresaw it, in the mind that remembered it, in the patience to wait for the right moment. Yet behind all her observation, Catherine's private sorrows lingered. Nights in her chambers were lonelier than the banquets were bright. The laughter of courtiers echoed faintly down the corridors, while she sat alone, a book open on her lap, the candle burning low. She longed for acceptance, for affection, for a place in the grand tapestry of court life. Instead, she found herself a shadow at the edge, a foreign girl who could not quite belong. And so she endured both splendor and isolation. She dined at tables laden with silver, yet swallowed the bitterness of mockery. She wore gowns heavy with jewels, yet felt the weight of loneliness pressing heavier still. Every night was both spectacle and lesson, glittering performance and whispered intrigue. This was the court that would shape her, the theater where she learned to play her role with patience, where she absorbed the language of power spoken not in words but in glances, gestures, and silences. It was dazzling, intoxicating, and dangerous, a hall of mirrors where truth was always just beyond reach. From these glittering halls, dear listener, let us move now to Catherine's private chambers, where beneath the finery and spectacle lay her deepest struggles. For while the world saw jewels and banquets, within her heart she bore the quiet pain of loneliness, and the desperate hope for the children who might one day secure her place. In the glittering halls of the French court, where jewels sparkled and music never ceased, Catherine de' Medici carried a burden that no gold or perfume could disguise. For all the feasts and dances, for all the pageantry of her new life, she remained marked by one painful absence, an heir. In the 16th century, a queen's worth was measured not in wisdom or beauty, but in the children she bore, the future kings and queens she gave to her country. A barren queen was a useless queen, and whispers of her failure could echo louder than the toll of any cathedral bell. For Catherine, the years after her marriage to Henry, Duke of Orleans, were years of silence, years where no child's cry echoed in her chambers, no cradle rocked beside her bed. Imagine her in those early years. A young bride, not yet 20, kneeling before her bedside in prayer. The room is dim, the only light the flickering flame of a candle. Her gown, though rich, hangs heavy on her shoulders, her dark hair falls loose about her face. She clasps her hands together, her lips whispering silent pleas to God, to the Virgin, to any saint who might hear her. Her voice trembles not with vanity, but with desperation, to be seen, to be accepted, to belong. Yet the court was not merciful. Servants carried gossip like birds carry seeds, scattering it from hall to hall. The little Italian, they murmured, she cannot give us an heir. Perhaps she is cursed, perhaps her family's shadow follows her. Courtiers laughed behind feathered fans, and noblewomen cast pitying glances in her direction. Each feast, each banquet, became not a celebration but a silent judgment. Henry, her husband, was no comfort. Though bound to her in name, his heart belonged to another, Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years his senior, beautiful, commanding, and utterly captivating. To Catherine's sorrow, Diane became not only Henry's mistress but also his advisor, guiding his choices, shaping his tastes. It was to Diane that Henry gave jewels, estates, and devotion. To Catherine, he gave cold politeness, the minimum courtesy demanded by marriage. And yet Catherine endured. She did not rage, she did not cry out in public. Instead, she bent without breaking. She turned her prayers into discipline, her humiliation into patience. In the stillness of her chambers, she wept softly, but in the corridors of power, she kept her gaze steady, her steps measured. Whispers tell of her turning to remedies both spiritual and strange. Physicians were summoned, offering tinctures and powders said to restore fertility. Midwives whispered of herbal infusions brewed from roots and blossoms gathered at dusk. Even astrologers cast her stars, promising that the heavens themselves would one day bless her womb. Some say she drank elixirs laced with curious ingredients, others that she wore charms against her skin, small amulets hidden beneath her gowns. Whether these stories are true or not, they reveal the desperation of those years, when Catherine searched for any thread of hope. Servants, watching from the shadows, saw her struggle. They saw her pause before every chapel altar, kneeling longer than any noble. They heard her muffled sobs at night when the torches had burned low. They whispered of her pacing before the fire, clutching rosary beads so tightly her fingers bled. And yet, they also saw her rise each morning, her hair arranged, her gown fastened, her face calm, as though the night had never held such sorrow. Then, after nearly a decade of waiting, prayers were answered. In 1544, Catherine bore her first child, a boy named Francis. At last, her chambers rang with the cry of a newborn, and her arms cradled the promise of a future king. The court, so long unkind, now erupted in celebration. Bells rang, courtiers bowed, and Catherine stood taller, the weight of shame lifting at last. The joy did not end there. In the years that followed, Catherine would bear 9 more children. Her body, once doubted, became the vessel of France's future. Each child was both triumph and trial, fragile lives born into a world of ambition and peril. She loved them fiercely, perhaps more fiercely because she had waited so long, endured so much to have them. Picture her, dear listener, in her chambers, holding an infant swaddled in silk. The candlelight glows softly on her tired face, her eyes red from sleepless nights. Yet her smile is tender, her hand brushing gently over the child's cheek. For a moment, she is not the foreign bride mocked by courtiers, not the shadow whispered about in rumors. She is simply a mother, her heart full, her soul at peace. But joy, in the French court, was never without danger. With children came new challenges, questions of alliances, of marriages, of religion. Catherine, who had endured loneliness and humiliation in silence, now faced a different kind of trial, the survival not only of herself, but of her dynasty. For each child was not only her joy but also a pawn on the vast chessboard of European power. The Medici girl who had once clutched her book in silence, mocked by laughing courtiers, had now given France a dynasty. Yet with each step forward, the shadows lengthened. Her children would grow into fragile kings and troubled queens, their lives marked by war, faith, and betrayal. Catherine, once dismissed as powerless, would become the guardian of them all, whether by prayer, by cunning, or by whatever means survival demanded. Her loneliness had shaped her patience. Her childlessness had sharpened her endurance. And her children, when they finally came, became the reason she could not falter. But joy, dear listener, carries with it its own dangers. For in a court where ambition ruled and faith divided, even the laughter of children could be drowned out by the clash of swords. And it is here, from Catherine's long-awaited triumph, that we step into darker chambers still. Into her fascination with astrologers, with alchemists, and with the whispers of poison that would one day earn her a fearsome name. From the joy of children and the fragile triumph of motherhood, Catherine's life in the French court moved into stranger, darker realms. For though she was at last a mother and regent-to-be, the court never ceased to whisper. And whispers, once planted, grow into legends. Catherine was never without curiosity. From her childhood in Florence, surrounded by the heritage of scholars and artists, she had absorbed a fascination for knowledge. Books of philosophy, writings of ancient physicians, treatises on the movements of the stars, all held her attention. In France, this curiosity deepened, and soon it wrapped itself around the hidden arts, astrology, alchemy, and the strange sciences that blurred the line between medicine and magic. Picture her chambers late at night. The banquets long over, the courtiers gone to their beds, Catherine remains awake. A small fire glows in the hearth, casting long shadows against the walls. Upon the table are scattered curious objects, glass vials filled with shimmering liquids, herbs hung in bundles to dry, parchments inked with star charts and calculations. A hooded astrologer leans over, tracing the arc of Saturn across the sky, while Catherine watches, her dark eyes reflecting the flame. To her, the heavens were a map, guiding destinies. She sought reassurance in the alignment of stars, counsel in the cryptic symbols of the zodiac. When her children were born, astrologers were summoned to read their fates. When wars loomed, she asked what the skies foretold. Some courtiers laughed at such practices, calling them superstition. Others whispered that Catherine was meddling in forbidden arts, that she sought power in places no queen should tread. And then there were the poisons. Rumors spread that Catherine kept a cabinet of secrets, a collection of phials hidden within a locked casket, filled with powders and potions known only to her. Some claimed she inherited them from the Medici apothecaries of Florence, masters of rare herbs and deadly tinctures. Others swore they saw her ladies carrying small jeweled rings with hidden compartments, perfect for delivering a fatal dose. The truth? We cannot say. Perhaps these were only stories spun from fear, the court's way of making sense of a queen who was too clever, too foreign, too difficult to trust. And yet, the whispers persisted. They said Catherine had her own shadowy circle, astrologers, physicians, and alchemists who worked in secret chambers, grinding roots, distilling waters, charting planets. They said her interest was not only in medicine, but in mastery, the kind of mastery that could heal or harm with equal ease. From these stories also emerged her flying squadron of women. These were her ladies-in-waiting, young and beautiful, carefully chosen not only for charm but for cunning. Sent into the glittering halls of the court, they were Catherine's eyes and ears. With laughter and conversation, with dances and stolen glances, they gathered secrets from powerful men. They whispered those secrets back to Catherine, who wove them into her strategies like threads into a tapestry. To her enemies, it seemed sorcery, women turned into weapons, beauty turned into influence. But did Catherine truly poison? Was she truly the dark sorceress her enemies painted her to be? Or was she, as always, a survivor, a woman who used the tools at hand to keep her children and her dynasty alive? Imagine, dear listener, the scene again, Catherine at her table, a candle burning low, the air scented with rosemary and sage. Her hand moves slowly across a parchment, tracing the stars, while a glass vial gleams faintly in the firelight. Outside her chamber, the court buzzes with rumor. Inside, there is only silence, and the steady patience of a woman who has learned that power comes not from strength, but from endurance, from knowledge, from the unseen. Fact and legend blur here. Perhaps Catherine did keep potions. Perhaps she only sought medicine in a world of uncertainty. Perhaps her flying squadron were no more than loyal companions, their charms exaggerated by scandal. Or perhaps the truth is stranger still, half hidden in the shadows where history seldom shines. What is certain is this: Catherine cultivated an image both mysterious and formidable. She did not chase away the rumors of poison and magic, she let them linger. Fear, after all, could be as powerful as truth. A whisper could silence a rival just as surely as a dagger. Thus Catherine became not only queen, but myth. Not only mother of kings, but the poison queen, the shadow at the edge of every chamber, the presence behind every intrigue. And whether the tales were true or false, they ensured her survival. For in a world where women were often powerless, Catherine made even rumor her ally. And so, from the secret chambers of alchemists and the whispered tales of poison, let us step into the council halls of France. For Catherine's fate was no longer bound only to potions and prophecy, it would soon be bound to the crown itself, as she rose to rule in her own right as queen regent of a divided and dangerous kingdom. The glittering banquets, the whispered intrigues, the nights of star charts and files, all of these were only preparation. For Catherine's true test came suddenly, with the death of her husband, King Henry II of France, in 1559. The tournament had been meant as a celebration. Knights in gleaming armor, banners waving, a joust to honor alliances. But a splintered lance struck Henry in the eye, piercing deep. Within days, the king was dead, and France was left reeling. Catherine, now in her early 40s, donned the black of mourning, a color she would never again set aside. Draped in sable gowns, her figure seemed less fragile, more formidable, as though grief itself had clothed her in strength. Her son Francis, only 15, ascended the throne. Too young, too fragile, too easily swayed by those around him, he left Catherine in a new position, regent in all but name, the guiding hand behind the crown. And when Francis died only a year later, his younger brother Charles became king, just 10 years old. Once more, Catherine stepped forward, not as a consort, not as a foreign bride, but as the regent of France. Picture the council chamber in those years. Long wooden tables scattered with maps, wax seals pressed onto documents, scrolls of treaties unfurled beside accounts of debts and taxes. The air heavy with smoke from torches, with the faint rustle of parchment, with the sharp voices of nobles arguing. France was not at peace. The kingdom was divided between Catholics and Protestants, their faiths clashing in bloody uprisings, their swords raised in holy zeal. One noble slams his fist upon the table, "Your Majesty, the heretics must be crushed. They defy Rome, they defy the crown." Another leans forward, his voice heated, "No, if we do not grant them freedom, we will drown in rebellion." Already the countryside burns. The chamber fills with shouts, accusations, demands. But at the center, Catherine sits silently. Her black gown pools around her, her veil shadows her face, but her eyes are steady, unblinking. She listens. She weighs. She does not match their fury with her own. Instead, her calmness unsettles them more than any outburst could. When she speaks, her voice is measured, even soothing. "France cannot bleed forever," she says. "We must bend where we cannot break. We must rule not with fire, but with patience." Her words carry not the passion of faith, but the pragmatism of survival. For Catherine's loyalty was not to one creed or another, it was to the throne, to her children, to the fragile thread of dynasty that kept France from falling into chaos. In this, she was unlike many of her peers. Where they saw only enemies to crush, Catherine saw the necessity of balance. She sought compromise, issuing edicts that granted Protestants limited freedoms, then restraining Catholics who raged against it. At times, she seemed to favor one side, then the other. To her enemies, this was proof of deceit, of cunning, of evil. But to Catherine, it was simple truth, that in a fractured kingdom, survival required shifting, bending, and holding the center as long as one could. Her black gowns became a symbol. Always in mourning, she reminded the court and the people alike of loss of her husband, loss of peace, loss of certainty. Yet she turned mourning into authority. In a hall filled with men in bright silks and armor, Catherine's black was like an anchor, steady, unchanging, formidable. Her children, the young kings, looked to her for guidance, whether they admitted it or not. Courtiers who once mocked her foreign ways now bent their heads before her, for it was she who held the balance of power. Even the fiercest nobles, who raged at her compromises, could not ignore her. Catherine endured them all, just as she had endured loneliness and scorn in her youth. Was she ruthless? At times. Was she cunning? Certainly. But evil? No. For Catherine was less interested in cruelty than in survival. She did not hunger for blood, she hungered for stability, for a France that would not collapse before her children's eyes. And if that meant using whispers, secrets, even fear, then so be it. Picture her walking the palace corridors at night, her black gown whispering against the stone, a candle in her hand. Behind her, portraits of kings long dead stare from the walls. Ahead of her lies the future, uncertain, fractured, fragile. Yet her steps are measured, her gaze unwavering. She carries the weight of a kingdom not with arrogance, but with endurance. This was Catherine as Queen Regent, calm where others raged, steady where others faltered, pragmatic where others clung to ideals. She became the mother not only of her children, but of France itself, stern, watchful, and unyielding. And yet, dear listener, in her steady hand lay seeds of greater tragedy. For compromise could not hold forever, and patience could not silence zealotry. The wars of religion would deepen, and Catherine's name would soon be tied to bloodshed that echoed through the streets of Paris. From her calm in the council chambers, let us step now into the storm outside, into the voices of resistance, of priests and reformers, of those who defied both crown and queen. For in Catherine's France, faith and power would collide with devastating force. France in the mid-16th century was a kingdom restless in spirit. Its fields were green, its rivers wide, its cities alive with trade, yet beneath this seeming prosperity ran a current of fear and anger. Faith divided families, neighbors, even friends. Catholics and Protestants, bound by the same language and land, found themselves drawn into suspicion, into conflict, into war. Catherine, as regent, sought compromise, but compromise is a fragile thread. And when the powerful tug too fiercely, that thread frays. Yet even as the great nobles clashed, even as armies marched and fires spread, there were smaller voices, gentle, persistent, quiet voices, that sought another path. Picture a small chapel in the countryside, its wooden beams weathered, its bell rusted with age. Inside, a priest lights candles, one by one, their flames casting soft halos on the stone walls. His congregation gathers, villagers whose hands are calloused from labor, whose faces are lined by sun and toil. They kneel together, whispering prayers not for conquest or vengeance, but for peace. The priest's voice trembles as he speaks, yet it carries strength. Against the roaring storm of war, his candle burns steadily. In another village, a Protestant healer tends to the sick. She walks the alleys with a lantern, her basket filled with herbs and poultices. Some whisper against her, her prayers are wrong, her faith dangerous, yet when fever strikes, when wounds fester, even her enemies call for her aid. She kneels beside the bedside of a Catholic child, pressing a cool cloth to his burning forehead, her lips murmuring words of comfort. In that moment, creed is forgotten. What remains is compassion, simple and human. Even in the cities, defiance took quiet forms. A teacher gathers children beneath a great banyan tree in the garden of a noble's estate. He opens a small book, its pages worn, its ink faded, and begins to read aloud. The words are of scripture, of wisdom, of the stories that bind communities together. The children sit cross-legged, their eyes wide, their mouths open in wonder. Soldiers may march in the streets beyond, but here, in the shade of the tree, knowledge passes gently from one generation to the next. And among women, too, voices rose. A widow, her husband lost in battle, lights a single candle each night at her window. She does not speak loudly, she does not call for vengeance. Her act is simple, a small flame burning against the darkness, a symbol of hope that one day her children will inherit a world less cruel. Neighbors pass her home and pause. Some bow their heads, some whisper a prayer of their own. Slowly, the single flame becomes a beacon, one quiet voice multiplied by many. Catherine knew of these small resistances. She watched as priests, healers, teachers, and widows pushed gently against the tide of violence. Some she supported, others she tolerated, a few she silenced when their words threatened to fracture her delicate balance. But she understood the power of such quiet defiance. She herself had survived not by shouting, but by waiting, by observing, by enduring. And so, in these ordinary acts, she recognized something of herself. Still, her own position remained perilous. To the Catholics, she seemed too lenient. To the Protestants, she seemed a deceiver. She walked a narrow path between two cliffs, the weight of her children's crowns upon her shoulders. Every edict she signed, every meeting she held, was met with suspicion. Rumors multiplied, as they always had. The Italian queen plays both sides, they said. She whispers of peace, but plans in poison. Perhaps Catherine did weave intrigues, perhaps she allowed her reputation as a shadowed figure to grow. But alongside her strategies, she carried the same candle of endurance, the same refusal to break. Like the priest lighting candles, like the healer walking alleys, like the widow tending her flame, Catherine survived by persistence. And so, dear listener, in these voices of resistance, in these small acts of quiet defiance, we see not only the people of France, but Catherine herself reflected. For history remembers the battles, the massacres, the bloodshed. But beneath those thunderous moments were countless soft voices, steady as whispers, enduring as the flicker of a flame. From these gentle flames of defiance, however, the storm would only grow stronger. For patience and compromise could not silence zealotry forever. Soon, Paris itself would become a furnace, its streets running red, its bells tolling not for prayer but for massacre. And Catherine's name, whether justly or not, would be forever bound to that night of blood. The summer of 1572 should have been a season of peace. The sun burned gently upon the tiled roofs of Paris, the Seine shimmered in the light, and banners hung across the city in celebration. A royal wedding had been arranged, the marriage of Marguerite de Valois, Catherine's daughter, to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant noble whose union with a Catholic princess was meant to heal the fractured kingdom. For days, Paris echoed with laughter, feasting, and processions. Bells rang not for battle, but for joy. And yet, beneath this glitter, fear coiled like a serpent. The city's Catholics mistrusted the Huguenots who filled the streets. The Protestants who had come to witness the wedding glanced nervously at the soldiers on the corners, their hands on sword hilts. Catherine moved among the celebrations, dressed in her mourning black, her expression unreadable. Some said she whispered calm into her son Charles IX's ear, others said she whispered fire. Then came the night of August 23, when the wedding celebrations faded and Paris prepared to sleep. The city lay hushed, streets emptied, candles flickering in windows. But in the shadows, men gathered with weapons, their faces tight with anger, their orders whispered low. Near midnight, a bell tolled. Slow, heavy, echoing across the rooftops. Then another, and another, until the air itself seemed to tremble. Doors burst open. Torches flared. And suddenly, the streets of Paris were not silent but screaming. Imagine the cobblestones, slick with rain and shadow. Now they ran with blood. Mobs surged forward, shouting holy war, their blades flashing in the light of fire. Houses of Protestants were broken into, families dragged out, names called from lists. The Seine carried not only boats but bodies, floating gently in the current, candles snuffed out in the dark. And above it all, the bells continued to toll, steady as a heartbeat, steady as doom. Picture a small chapel in the countryside, its wooden beams weathered, its bell rusted with age. Inside, a priest lights candles, one by one, their flames casting soft halos on the stone walls. His congregation gathers, villagers whose hands are calloused from labor, whose faces are lined by sun and toil. They kneel together, whispering prayers not for conquest or vengeance, but for peace. The priest's voice trembles as he speaks, yet it carries strength. Against the roaring storm of war, his candle burns steadily. In another village, a Protestant healer tends to the sick. She walks the alleys with a lantern, her basket filled with herbs and poultices. Some whisper against her, her prayers are wrong, her faith dangerous, yet when fever strikes, when wounds fester, even her enemies call for her aid. She kneels beside the bedside of a Catholic child, pressing a cool cloth to his burning forehead, her lips murmuring words of comfort. In that moment, creed is forgotten. What remains is compassion, simple and human. Even in the cities, defiance took quiet forms. A teacher gathers children beneath a great banyan tree in the garden of a noble's estate. He opens a small book, its pages worn, its ink faded, and begins to read aloud. The words are of scripture, of wisdom, of the stories that bind communities together. The children sit cross-legged, their eyes wide, their mouths open in wonder. Soldiers may march in the streets beyond, but here, in the shade of the tree, knowledge passes gently from one generation to the next. And among women, too, voices rose. A widow, her husband lost in battle, lights a single candle each night at her window. She does not speak loudly, she does not call for vengeance. Her act is simple, a small flame burning against the darkness, a symbol of hope that one day her children will inherit a world less cruel. Neighbors pass her home and pause. Some bow their heads, some whisper a prayer of their own. Slowly, the single flame becomes a beacon, one quiet voice multiplied by many. Catherine knew of these small resistances. She watched as priests, healers, teachers, and widows pushed gently against the tide of violence. Some she supported, others she tolerated, a few she silenced when their words threatened to fracture her delicate balance. But she understood the power of such quiet defiance. She herself had survived not by shouting, but by waiting, by observing, by enduring. And so, in these ordinary acts, she recognized something of herself. Still, her own position remained perilous. To the Catholics, she seemed too lenient. To the Protestants, she seemed a deceiver. She walked a narrow path between two cliffs, the weight of her children's crowns upon her shoulders. Every edict she signed, every meeting she held, was met with suspicion. Rumors multiplied, as they always had. The Italian queen plays both sides, they said. She whispers of peace, but plans in poison. Perhaps Catherine did weave intrigues, perhaps she allowed her reputation as a shadowed figure to grow. But alongside her strategies, she carried the same candle of endurance, the same refusal to break. Like the priest lighting candles, like the healer walking alleys, like the widow tending her flame, Catherine survived by persistence. And so, dear listener, in these voices of resistance, in these small acts of quiet defiance, we see not only the people of France, but Catherine herself reflected. For history remembers the battles, the massacres, the bloodshed. But beneath those thunderous moments were countless soft voices, steady as whispers, enduring as the flicker of a flame. From these gentle flames of defiance, however, the storm would only grow stronger. For patience and compromise could not silence zealotry forever. Soon, Paris itself would become a furnace, its streets running red, its bells tolling not for prayer but for massacre. And Catherine's name, whether justly or not, would be forever bound to that night of blood. The summer of 1572 should have been a season of peace. The sun burned gently upon the tiled roofs of Paris, the Seine shimmered in the light, and banners hung across the city in celebration. A royal wedding had been arranged, the marriage of Marguerite de Valois, Catherine's daughter, to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant noble whose union with a Catholic princess was meant to heal the fractured kingdom. For days, Paris echoed with laughter, feasting, and processions. Bells rang not for battle, but for joy. And yet, beneath this glitter, fear coiled like a serpent. The city's Catholics mistrusted the Huguenots who filled the streets. The Protestants who had come to witness the wedding glanced nervously at the soldiers on the corners, their hands on sword hilts. Catherine moved among the celebrations, dressed in her mourning black, her expression unreadable. Some said she whispered calm into her son Charles IX's ear, others said she whispered fire. Then came the night of August 23, when the wedding celebrations faded and Paris prepared to sleep. The city lay hushed, streets emptied, candles flickering in windows. But in the shadows, men gathered with weapons, their faces tight with anger, their orders whispered low. Near midnight, a bell tolled. Slow, heavy, echoing across the rooftops. Then another, and another, until the air itself seemed to tremble. Doors burst open. Torches flared. And suddenly, the streets of Paris were not silent but screaming. Imagine the cobblestones, slick with rain and shadow. Now they ran with blood. Mobs surged forward, shouting holy war, their blades flashing in the light of fire. Houses of Protestants were broken into, families dragged out, names called from lists. The Seine carried not only boats but bodies, floating gently in the current, candles snuffed out in the dark. And above it all, the bells continued to toll, steady as a heartbeat, steady as doom. The massacre stretched for days. At first, it was only Paris, its narrow lanes choked with smoke and corpses. Then it spread to the provinces, to towns and villages across France. Brother turned against brother, neighbor against neighbor. In every corner of the kingdom, suspicion lit like tinder, and flames rose. By the end, thousands were dead. The royal wedding meant to heal France had instead torn it deeper apart. And where was Catherine? Some said she walked the palace halls, her veil hiding a cold smile, the architect of all. Others claimed she was terrified, her hands trembling as she tried to calm her son, who, it is said, was driven half-mad by the slaughter. The truth remains uncertain, hidden behind centuries of rumor and myth. Did she plan the killings? Did she simply fail to stop them? Or was she caught in a storm greater than even she could control? Picture her in her chamber, candlelight flickering across her black gown, the muffled roar of the mob rising from beyond the palace walls. She sits motionless, listening to the sound of bells and screams mingling with the night air. Outside, Paris burns. Inside, the Queen's face is unreadable, her silence heavier than any command. This was the night that sealed her legacy. Not the girl mocked in Florence, not the bride scorned at the French court, not even the regent who guided kings. History would remember Catherine de' Medici as the Poison Queen, the Black Queen, the woman whose hand, real or imagined, was stained forever with blood. And yet, as we walk softly through these streets in our minds, what we find is not a monster's roar, but something quieter. The massacre was thunderous, yes, but from afar it echoes like distant thunder, rumbling across the centuries. The flames that lit Paris have long since faded, yet the smoke lingers in memory. And the silence that followed. That long, uneasy silence, was perhaps more haunting than the cries themselves. Think of the survivors, a widow clutching her children in the dark, trembling at every sound. A young man hiding beneath floorboards, listening to footsteps pass above. A priest, his hands still stained with wax from the candles he tried to keep burning, whispering prayers no one could hear. These were the echoes of that night, fragile, human, trembling in the face of chaos. The Seine flowed on, indifferent, carrying its burden out to the sea. The bells grew still. The torches died. And Paris awoke to streets that were quiet once more, quiet not with peace, but with emptiness. Dear listener, in this moment we pause. We pause not to judge, not to shout, but to breathe. To recognize the fragility of life, the ease with which celebration turns to ruin, with which joy turns to fear. Catherine's hand in it all will forever be debated, but the tragedy itself is beyond doubt. And so, as we leave these blood-soaked streets behind, we step softly into reflection. For after such thunder, only silence remains. And in that silence, Catherine's story moves toward its end, toward the shadowed legacy she could never escape, and toward the whispers of history that still follow her name. The halls of the French court grew quieter in Catherine's final years. No longer the glitter of endless banquets, no longer the thunder of justs or the tense debates of council chambers. Instead, the sound of her own footsteps echoed softly through the palace corridors, the tap of shoes on stone blending with the faint rustle of her black mourning gown. Always black. Always mourning. For Catherine had buried too many, her husband, her children, her allies, her enemies. She had outlived nearly everyone who once mocked her, nearly everyone who once whispered of her. And yet she did not outlive the shadows those whispers left behind. Picture her as an old queen, a candle in hand, the flame trembling as she passes portraits of her lost family. Henry II, her husband, smiling in his armor. Francis, the fragile boy king, taken too soon. Charles IX, haunted by memories of blood. Even Henry III, her last surviving son, drifting further from her in rebellion and pride. Each portrait a reminder, each face staring back with silent accusation or sorrow. Catherine walks past them slowly, her eyes lowered, her lips pressed thin. She had fought to preserve her family's place upon the throne, yet in the end, France seemed determined to unravel. Outside her chambers, the kingdom crumbled. Civil wars raged on, Catholics and Protestants locked in endless struggle. The edicts she had once issued for balance were ignored or broken. Her children, whom she had loved with a fierce, desperate loyalty, became pawns and combatants in battles too vast for even a queen mother to control. And so Catherine withdrew into herself. At night, she would sit in silence, the candle burning low, the scent of wax filling the room. Servants whispered of her health failing, of her eyes dimming, of her body growing frail. But her mind remained sharp, watchful, restless. Did she reflect on her choices? Did she wonder if she might have steered France toward peace instead of war? Or did she, as some believed, see herself only as a survivor, a woman who endured poison in every form, political, spiritual, and perhaps even literal? The world outside remembered her differently. Pamphlets called her the Black Queen, the poisoner of France, the Italian witch who brought ruin. Tales grew of her secret vials, her hidden laboratories, her astrologers reading the stars in candlelit rooms. But others remembered her as the mother who kept a dynasty alive against impossible odds, who endured humiliation and danger with a spine of iron, who fought not for glory but for survival. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps neither. History does not always draw clean lines between villain and savior. Catherine de' Medici lived in the shadows, and shadows rarely give us clarity. And so, dear listener, as we end our quiet walk through her story, let us stand beside her in those last years, an old queen dressed in black, her candle flickering, her gaze lingering on faces now gone. Was she the poison, or was she surrounded by a poisoned world? The answer lies not in certainty, but in whispers. For even queens fade into silence. Their footsteps grow softer, their candles burn out. Yet history keeps their names alive, carrying them gently into the night. Catherine de' Medici remains with us not in shouts of triumph or condemnation, but in the hush of questions that linger. Rest now, for the story has ended. The halls grow still, the lamps dim, and the queen retreats into shadow. And as you drift towards sleep, let history's whisper guide you, that power, love, and survival are never simple, never pure, but always human.